The icy wind cut through General George Washington's threadbare coat as he gazed across the frozen Delaware River on the night of December 25th, 1776. Behind him, his ragged Continental Army huddled around dying campfires, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. The Revolution hung by a thread thinner than the ice forming on the river's edge. Washington's weathered hands gripped the rail of the Durham boat. As his mind churned with desperate calculations, the British had driven his forces from New York. In a series of humiliating defeats, Philadelphia lay vulnerable, and many of his soldiers' enlistments would expire at midnight on December 31st. In less than a week, he might command nothing more than empty camps and bitter memories. "Sir, the boats are ready," whispered Colonel John Glover, commander of the Marblehead fishermen, whose maritime expertise would prove crucial in the hours ahead. The Massachusetts regiment had already begun ferrying the 2,400 Continental soldiers across the treacherous waters, their oars muffled with cloth to avoid detection by British patrols. The crossing took 9 brutal hours. Chunks of ice, some as large as wagon wheels, threatened to crush the overloaded vessels. Private John Greenwood later recalled watching his comrades' faces turn blue in the bitter cold, their muskets growing slick with frozen moisture. Many men had no shoes. Others wrapped their feet in strips of canvas torn from supply bags. As dawn broke over New Jersey on December 26th, Washington's gamble began to unfold. The surprise attack on Trenton caught the Hessian garrison completely unprepared. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, had dismissed warnings of American activity, believing Washington's army too demoralized to mount any serious offensive. His fatal overconfidence would cost him his life and hand Washington a desperately needed victory. The triumph at Trenton electrified the colonies and bought Washington precious time. But it also created a new problem. British General Charles Cornwallis, recalled from his planned return to England, assembled 8,000 troops to crush the upstart Americans once and for all. As Washington's scouts reported the approaching British columns, the general faced another impossible choice: retreat across the Delaware again, or somehow find a way to strike another miraculous blow against overwhelming odds. The fate of the Revolution and the nascent nation would be decided in the coming days. On the frozen fields of New Jersey, Washington's next move would either cement his reputation as a master tactician or mark the beginning of the end for American independence. The stakes could not have been higher as the year 1776 drew to its close. Thomas Paine's words echoed in the minds of the Continental soldiers. These are the times that try men's souls. Indeed, the very soul of America hung in the balance as Washington prepared to roll the dice one more time in what would become known as the 10 crucial days that saved the American Revolution. General Charles Cornwallis rode at the head of his imposing column as it thundered through the New Jersey countryside on January 2nd, 1777. His scarlet coat gleamed despite the winter mud, and confidence radiated from his bearing. This time, he would corner the fox Washington and end this rebellion once and for all. "We shall bag the old fox before evening," Cornwallis declared to his staff officers as they approached Trenton. Behind him marched some of Britain's finest regiments, the 17th Light Dragoons, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Light Infantry, and battle-hardened grenadiers whose reputation alone had broken enemy lines across the continents. Washington watched the British approach from his position along the Sunpink Creek. His army, swollen to approximately 5,000 men by militia, reinforcements, and Pennsylvania troops under General Cadwalader, occupied strong defensive positions along the creek's banks. Artillery commanded by the young Captain Alexander Hamilton and Captain Thomas Forrest dominated the stone bridge, the only viable crossing point. As the afternoon light began to fade on January 2nd, Cornwallis launched his assault. British infantry advanced in perfect formation, their bayonets glinting in the winter sun. The sight should have terrified Washington's ragtag Continentals, many of whom had never faced a proper British charge. Instead, Hamilton's guns roared to life. Grapeshot swept the bridge approach, turning disciplined ranks into chaos. American musket fire crackled from behind stone walls and earthworks. 3 times the British charged the bridge. 3 times they fell back, leaving their dead scattered on the frozen ground. According to contemporary accounts recorded in the Pennsylvania Journal, the battle's intensity shocked even veteran observers. British losses mounted as Washington's men, emboldened by their recent victory at Trenton, fought with newfound determination. The sight of redcoats retreating filled the Americans with an intoxicating sense of possibility. As darkness fell, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. Convinced he had Washington trapped with his back to the creek, the British general decided to rest his troops and finish the Americans in the morning. "We'll bag him tomorrow," he told his subordinates, settling into comfortable quarters in Trenton. But Washington had no intention of waiting for morning. As his officers gathered in a commandeered farmhouse, the general unveiled a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. While keeping his campfires burning and posting guards to maintain the illusion of a sleeping army, Washington would march his entire force around Cornwallis's flank under cover of darkness. The target, Princeton, defended by only a small British garrison, but strategically vital as a supply depot and communications hub. A successful strike would not only avoid the trap Cornwallis had set, but potentially cut British supply lines and force their retreat from central New Jersey. Colonel Joseph Reed, Washington's trusted aide, later described the meeting as electrifying. Officers who had seemed beaten down by months of retreat suddenly straightened their shoulders. Here was leadership bold, decisive, and utterly committed to victory against impossible odds. As midnight approached, Washington's army began its ghostly march along back roads known only to local guides like Thomas Olden and Richard McCree, whose intimate knowledge of Princeton's surrounding countryside would prove invaluable in the hours ahead. The wheels of artillery pieces had been wrapped in rags to muffle their sound. As Washington's army crept through the frigid New Jersey night, Captain John Marshall, who would later become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, commanded a detachment of Virginia troops in this ghostly procession. Years later, he would recall the eerie silence broken only by the crunch of frozen ground beneath 5,000 pairs of feet. Washington rode near the head of the column, his imposing figure wrapped in a dark cloak that made him nearly invisible. Against the star-studded sky, the temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and many soldiers left scarlet trails in the snow where their bare feet had cracked and bled. Yet none complained. The memory of their recent victories at Trenton had kindled something fierce and unbreakable in their hearts. The march route stretched for nearly 12 miles along winding country roads that local patriot guides like Thomas Olden knew intimately. These men risked everything by leading Washington's army through their neighborhood, knowing that discovery would mean hanging as traitors to the crown. Their courage embodied the civilian dedication that made American victory possible. Behind the main column, a small detachment under Captain Alexander Hamilton maintained the deception at Assunpink Creek. They kept campfires blazing and posted sentries to create the illusion that Washington's entire army remained trapped against the creek. British patrols reported seeing the flickering flames and hearing movement in the American camp, confirming Cornwallis's belief that his quarry remained snared. As the night wore on, fatigue began to take its toll. Men stumbled and fell, helped to their feet by comrades who barely had strength to stand themselves. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, but still the column pressed forward. Washington frequently dismounted to walk among his troops, offering quiet words of encouragement that somehow made the impossible march bearable. Dawn was breaking as the army reached Stony Brook, just 2 miles from Princeton. Washington divided his force into two columns. General John Sullivan would take the main body along the post road toward Princeton's center, while General Nathanael Greene's division would swing wide to attack from the north. The coordination required split-second timing and flawless execution from exhausted men who had been marching for 8 hours through bitter cold. Sullivan's advance guard, commanded by Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, and Lieutenant James Monroe, future President of the United States, moved forward as scouts. Their mission was to locate and neutralize British pickets before the main assault could be detected. The success of the entire operation depended on maintaining surprise until the moment of attack. As reported in historical records maintained by the Princeton Battlefield State Park, the British garrison under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood remained completely unaware of the approaching danger. They had received no warning from Cornwallis, who still believed Washington remained trapped at Trenton. The stage was set for one of the most brilliant tactical surprises in military history. The eastern sky began to lighten, casting long shadows across the frozen fields around Princeton. In less than an hour, those fields would witness a battle that would transform the American Revolution from a desperate rebellion into a genuine war of liberation. Washington checked his pocket watch as his columns deployed for battle. Everything now depended on timing, courage, and the hope that his weary soldiers could summon one more miracle. The first British picket fell to Captain William Washington's advance guard. At precisely 7 o'clock on the morning of January 3rd, 1777. Private Hugh White of the 40th Regiment of Foot crumpled silently into the snow, his musket unfired, as American scouts swept through Princeton's outer defenses like hunting wolves. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood had just finished his morning inspection of the 40th Regiment when the sound of distant musket fire crackled across the frozen landscape, initially dismissing it as hunters or militia harassment. He ordered his men to form ranks as a precaution. Within minutes, that caution would save his life and the lives of many of his soldiers. General John Sullivan's column emerged from the morning mist like vengeful spirits, their battle cry of Princeton, Princeton, echoing across the fields. The 40th Regiment, caught in the open near William Clark's farmhouse, managed only a ragged volley before Sullivan's Continentals crashed into their ranks. With fixed bayonets, the British line buckled but did not break. Meanwhile, General Nathanael Greene's division approached from the north, their arrival perfectly timed to create a devastating crossfire. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, horses lathered from the forced march, unlimbered their 6-pound cannons on the high ground near the Quaker Meeting House. The first artillery round screamed overhead, one cannonball allegedly passing through Nassau Hall and becoming embedded in the wall, a mark that visitors can still observe today. The battle's crucial moment came when Captain William Washington's cavalry and Lieutenant James Monroe's infantry charged the British position near the Clark farm. Monroe took a severed artery in his shoulder from a musket ball, but continued fighting until blood loss dropped him unconscious. Washington's horse was shot from under him, but the captain seized the regimental colors of the 40th and waved them triumphantly over his head. According to contemporary battlefield accounts preserved in the New Jersey Historical Society archives, the sight of British colors in American hands had an electrifying effect on Washington's troops. Men who had been retreating for months across the states suddenly found themselves advancing against professional British soldiers and winning. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood attempted a desperate countercharge with his remaining troops. The British officer, known for his personal courage, led from the front with sword drawn, his scarlet coat making him a perfect target for American marksmen. Only the confusion of battle and thick powder smoke saved him from certain death. As he rallied his men for one final stand, General Washington himself appeared at the most critical moment, his white charger carrying him directly between the opposing lines as musket balls whistled past his head. His aides begged him to seek cover, but Washington remained exposed, his presence steadying his troops and inspiring them to press their advantage. Captain John Marshall later wrote that seeing Washington in the thick of battle convinced him that Providence itself favored the American cause. The British resistance finally crumbled when Hamilton's artillery found the range to their position. Grape shot tore through the ranks of the 40th Regiment, and Mawhood ordered a fighting retreat toward the post road. His disciplined withdrawal prevented a complete rout, but could not disguise the reality of British defeat. Nassau Hall, Princeton's most prominent building and symbol of British authority in central New Jersey, surrendered after a brief artillery bombardment. Captain Hamilton himself is credited with placing the shot that convinced the British garrison to raise the white flag. The symbolic importance of this moment resonated far beyond the tactical victory. American forces had driven the mighty British Army from one of their most prestigious strongholds. The silence that followed the British retreat seemed almost supernatural to the Continental soldiers, standing among the dead and wounded on Princeton's battlefield. Powder smoke drifted across the frozen ground like morning fog, and the sharp scent of burnt gunpowder mingled with the metallic smell of blood on snow. For a moment, 5,000 American rebels stood in stunned recognition of what they had accomplished. General Washington dismounted near Nassau Hall, his weathered face bearing an expression his officers had rarely seen, genuine satisfaction, mixed with something approaching wonder. Captain John Fitzgerald, his Irish aide-de-camp, later wrote to his family that the general seemed to grow taller as he surveyed the captured British positions. The psychological weight of constant retreat had lifted from Washington's shoulders. In a single morning's work, the material gains from Princeton were significant but not decisive. American forces captured nearly 300 British prisoners, substantial quantities of supplies, and 10 artillery pieces that would prove valuable in future engagements. More importantly, they had seized Nassau Hall, transforming the college building from a symbol of British dominance into an emblem of American defiance. But the true impact of Princeton lay in its psychological and political ramifications. News of the victory spread through the colonies with unprecedented speed. carried by riders who could barely contain their excitement. The Pennsylvania Journal reported that General Washington has struck another glorious blow for liberty, while the New York Gazette proclaimed the victory a turning point in our struggle for independence. These contemporary accounts, preserved in colonial newspaper archives, reveal how profoundly Princeton affected American morale. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood's retreat had larger consequences than either army initially realized. The British withdrawal from Princeton forced General Cornwallis to abandon his comfortable quarters in Trenton and begin a humiliating pursuit of an enemy he had believed trapped. When Cornwallis's scouts finally reached Princeton, they found only American pickets and evidence of their earlier victory. The ripple effects extended far beyond New Jersey's borders. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had fled the capital in panic just weeks earlier, began discussing their return. Robert Morris, the colony's financial wizard, found new confidence to negotiate desperately needed loans from European allies. The prospect of American victory, which had seemed impossible just days earlier, suddenly appeared not only possible, but probable. Perhaps most significantly, Princeton's success convinced thousands of American militia members to extend their service or enlist for longer terms. The Continental Army's ranks, which had been bleeding away through desertion and expired enlistments, began to refill with volunteers inspired by Washington's dramatic turnaround. These reinforcements would prove crucial in sustaining the revolutionary effort. Through the difficult campaigns ahead, foreign observers took notice as well. Intelligence reports reaching London described American forces that fought with newfound confidence and tactical sophistication. French diplomats, already intrigued by the possibility of weakening their British rivals, began more serious discussions about providing aid to the American rebels. The path toward the French alliance that would ultimately secure American independence began on the frozen fields of Princeton. Washington himself recognized the victory's broader significance. In his official report to Congress, he wrote that the success at Princeton had given such a turn to our affairs that I am confident we shall soon drive the enemy entirely from the Jerseys. His confidence proved prophetic. Within weeks, British forces had withdrawn to positions near New York, abandoning most of New Jersey to American control. The transformation was visible in the faces of Washington's soldiers as they prepared to march from Princeton. Men who had crossed the Delaware as beaten refugees now carried themselves as conquerors. The British evacuation from Princeton marked the beginning of a strategic collapse that would reshape the entire war. Within 48 hours of Washington's victory, General Henry Clinton received urgent dispatches from outposts throughout central New Jersey, reporting American militia attacks on supply convoys, communication lines, and isolated garrisons. The countryside, which had seemed pacified just a week earlier, had suddenly become hostile territory swarming with emboldened patriots. Captain Johann Ewald, a Hessian officer whose diary provides invaluable insights into the British perspective, wrote that the rebels had become wolves where before they were sheep. His professional soldier's assessment captured a fundamental shift in the war's dynamics. American forces were no longer simply reacting to British moves. They had seized the initiative and were forcing their enemies to respond to American strategy. The psychological impact extended far beyond the battlefield. In the drawing rooms of Philadelphia and Boston, wealthy merchants who had remained carefully neutral began making discreet inquiries about supporting the Continental cause. The prospect of British defeat, unthinkable just days earlier, suddenly demanded serious consideration. These subtle shifts in elite opinion would prove crucial as the war evolved from a regional rebellion into a global conflict. Benjamin Franklin, representing American interests in Paris, received news of Princeton just as he was preparing for delicate negotiations with French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the French Foreign Ministry archives, Franklin's ability to cite recent American victories dramatically strengthened his negotiating position. The French government, perpetually seeking opportunities to weaken Britain, found themselves dealing with what appeared to be a genuinely viable military alliance, rather than desperate rebels seeking charity. General Cornwallis faced a dilemma that would plague British strategy for the remainder of the war. His orders demanded aggressive action to crush the rebellion, but Princeton had demonstrated the risks of pursuing Washington's army too aggressively. The American general had proven himself capable of turning apparent defeat into stunning victory. With frightening speed, caution seemed prudent, but caution allowed the rebellion to strengthen and spread. The British command structure, designed for conventional European warfare, struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight by established rules. Washington's night march to Princeton violated every principle of military science taught at British staff colleges. Armies were supposed to rest at night, establish secure camps, and engage in daylight battles where superior training and equipment would determine the outcome. Washington's willingness to break these rules gave him advantages that traditional British tactics could not counter. King George III's reaction to news from Princeton revealed the growing concern in London about American capabilities. Royal correspondence suggests the king began questioning whether military force alone could restore British authority in America. The rebellion was spreading to regions previously considered loyal, and each American victory encouraged further resistance throughout the empire. The logistical implications of Princeton extended far beyond New Jersey. British supply lines, already stretched thin by the enormous costs of maintaining armies in America, faced increased pressure from militia attacks encouraged by Continental success. Every wagon of supplies that failed to reach British garrisons weakened their ability to maintain control over occupied territory. Washington's army, meanwhile, established winter quarters in Morristown with confidence restored and morale transformed. The general, who had led a broken army across the Delaware less than 2 weeks earlier, now commanded forces that believed in their cause and their commander. The Continental Army emerging from the 10 crucial days bore little resemblance to the demoralized rabble that had fled across New Jersey in December. The revolution had been reborn at Princeton, but its ultimate success would depend on whether Washington could sustain this momentum through the challenges ahead. The winter of 1777 found General Washington established in the hills around Morristown, New Jersey, commanding an army transformed by victory. The Continental forces that had fled in panic across New Jersey just weeks earlier now occupied a position of strategic dominance, controlling the vital roads connecting New York to Philadelphia, while British forces huddled in isolated enclaves. Along the coast, the strategic situation had reversed so completely that General William Howe, commanding British forces in New York, was forced to abandon plans for an early spring offensive against Philadelphia. Instead, his dispatches to London requested substantial reinforcements to deal with what he now characterized 500 as a serious military threat rather than a colonial uprising. The language shift reflected a fundamental change in British thinking about the American conflict. European military observers studying the Princeton campaign identified tactical innovations that would influence warfare for generations. Washington's night march, his coordination of multiple columns converging on a single target, and his brilliant use of deception had created a new model for how smaller forces could defeat larger armies through superior mobility and intelligence. Military academies from Prussia to France began studying these American methods. The political ramifications proved even more significant than the military ones. The Continental Congress, which had been preparing to flee Philadelphia in December, returned to the city in February with renewed confidence in American independence. Delegates, who had privately questioned the viability of separation from Britain, now spoke openly of victory and the challenges of governing an independent nation. Financial support, previously almost impossible to obtain, began flowing toward the Continental cause. Robert Morris successfully negotiated loans from European bankers who suddenly viewed American independence as a profitable investment rather than a hopeless gamble. The hard currency provided by these loans allowed Washington to address some of his army's most pressing supply shortages. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes accelerated his secret negotiations with American representatives, convinced by Princeton that the rebels possessed sufficient military capability to warrant formal alliance. The treaty that would bring France openly into the war against Britain had its origins in the strategic calculations prompted by Washington's New Jersey victories. British public opinion, as reflected in London newspapers and parliamentary debates, began showing signs of war weariness for the first time since the conflict began. The Morning Chronicle questioned whether the expense in blood and treasure of subduing America could be justified by any conceivable benefit to Britain. Such criticism, unthinkable before Princeton, suggested growing domestic pressure for negotiated settlement. The battle's impact on American identity extended far beyond military considerations. Princeton proved that American forces could not only resist British power, but actively defeat it through superior strategy and determination. This psychological transformation from colonial subjects to independent actors capable of determining their own destiny, represented perhaps the most important outcome of the 10 crucial days. Washington himself emerged from Princeton as more than just a military commander. His willingness to risk everything on desperate gambles, combined with his ability to inspire ordinary soldiers to extraordinary achievements, established him as the embodiment of American resistance to tyranny. The mythic status that would eventually elevate him to the presidency began crystallizing in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The strategic principles Washington employed at Princeton, mobility, surprise, concentration of force at decisive points, and the willingness to accept tactical risks for strategic advantage became foundational elements of American military doctrine. Future generals from Nathanael Greene to Ulysses Grant would employ variations of these methods in their own campaigns. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of Princeton lay in its demonstration that ordinary people, properly led and sufficiently motivated, could defeat professional armies and established governments. The lesson resonated far beyond America's borders, inspiring democratic movements throughout Europe and beyond. The age of revolution that would transform the Western world in the late 18th century owed much to what Washington's ragged Continentals proved possible on that frozen January morning. The American Revolution entered a new phase at Princeton, one that would ultimately lead to Yorktown, independence, and the birth of a nation founded on principles tested in the crucible of war.